Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium on Friday night. I'm Diane Sayre, president of the LaRouche Organization, and we are in a very dramatic, fast-moving situation which requires the American people to quickly wake up, shake off whatever delusional fantasy world you've been in, and rally to ensure that our republic not only survives and prospers, but actually returns to its intended anti-colonial principles. Now, I just want to quickly remind people where we were under the Biden-Harris administration. If it were the Harris-Walz administration now, I'm not even sure we would still be here. We had ongoing genocide in Gaza, unlimited funds flowing both to Bibi Netanyahu and Volodymyr Zelensky. And the Biden administration then, having crossed over everything he said he would not do. He would not send tanks. He would not send F-16 fighters. Each of those things came to be violated. No long-range missiles. And after President Trump won the election, Biden began indeed allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike targets inside Russia. That is Russia as of the 2014. No one would dispute that this was Russian territory. And of course, since the Ukrainians don't have the guidance capability to do that, what it meant as far as Russia was concerned is that you had American and or NATO military officers guiding American, or in the other case, French missiles to hit targets in Russia, killing Russian people, destroying Russian infrastructure, a hot war. So we were a millimeter or less away from a full-on, perhaps, thermonuclear war with Russia. President Trump said that he could end this conflict in 24 hours, but what became very clear from the beginning of the negotiations is actually, despite the fact that there were people around him like Robert Kennedy Jr., who, while not so great on Israel Palestine, was very clear about Ukraine, Trump seemed to have some misunderstandings, i.e. that he was going to tell Putin to back off or something else. He had his first emissary, which either was a feint or just a test, in Keith Kellogg, didn't work. And then ended up having Steve Witkoff, who clearly is much more realistic, who also clearly has the capacity to hear what Russia is saying, and who is now being denounced as a Putin agent by the drug-addicted Volodymyr Zelensky. Maybe Steve Witkoff will find himself on the same Ukrainian hit list as myself and others. We'll see. We also had the spectacle in Europe, not only J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, blasting them for their suppression of elections and free speech, but the Europeans completely freaking out over the idea that the Ukraine-Russia war could be brought to a close and trying desperately to figure out ways to keep the war going, including sending troops, and now most recently proposing 800 billion or 900 billion euros to keep arming Ukraine, even though they don't have the energy or the industrial capability to do this. Now, Trump and Putin have had, at this point, two lengthy phone conversations. There's been meetings of their representatives in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And it's not merely that they want to resolve the Ukraine crisis, as Maria Zakharova explained in an interview with Scott Ritter. There have not been reasonable diplomatic relations between the US and Russia for about 16 years. That you had the Obama administration, which of course overthrew the government of Ukraine with Victoria Nuland, now teaching at Columbia University, along with Mike Pompeo and Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton under an Israeli spy, but that's another story. And so you had a mess under Obama. Then you had the first Trump term, but of course you had Russiagate, you had Pompeo, Nikki Haley, John Bolton in that administration. That wasn't working. And then you had Joe Biden, who said it was his purpose to destroy Russia and who literally was threatening Russia with World War III in a sense. So President Trump is confronted with undoing all of that. That's why there's a lot more going on in these talks than anything being reported to the press. That much I'm certain of. And the backdrop of all of this is the looming financial collapse of the transatlantic system, which, after all, since Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold reserve standard in gold reserve system in 1971, and then later you had the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which helped to enable the 2008 and since quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, 4, trillions of dollars manufactured out of thin air to bail out bankrupt, non-existent, fictitious financial instruments. This is a bubble ready to implode. And you have a new dynamic, something Lyndon LaRouche, in a sense, really laid the groundwork for with his proposals for an international development bank of the BRICS, the China Belt and Road Initiative, the Global South, recognizing that they have survived these sanctions. They have survived the use of the dollar as a weapon, that they can very well trade with each other, that amongst themselves, you now have about 5.5 or 6 billion people. So contrary to the line in the Western press that they are isolated, they are not isolated. We are becoming isolated. They are not isolated. And this has created an entirely new dynamic, which, if the United States were acting in its true self-interest and as the republic which we were founded to be, we would be thrilled to be a part of this new dynamic. We would be producing massive amounts of capital goods, exporting technology, taking advantage of the potential for developing markets all over the world. Unfortunately, we haven't quite arrived at that enlightened state, but we do have a president who at least professed that he doesn't want a war. He seems genuinely, rightly terrified of the idea of a nuclear war, and that creates a sort of boundary. So things seem to be moving. Also, right before President Trump came in, he, not Joe Biden, pressured Bibi Netanyahu to get a ceasefire in the Middle East. We got the release of a number of hostages, close to 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. Humanitarian aid was flowing into Gaza. And then Bibi Netanyahu stopped. He cut off the aid. He began bombing. The Houthis then began bombing Israeli ships, which they weren't. Suddenly, the next thing you know, we're bombing Yemen. And there is threatening talk of bombing Iran. So what is going on? Well, the British in particular are trying to figure out any means possible to stop the US and Russia from working together to end this war. In fact, just I guess today, there were strikes. There has been a so-called ceasefire agreed that Russia and Ukraine are not supposed to bomb each other's energy infrastructure, but there was a major attack on the Sudsa pipeline station, and the Russians say that they believe the British were responsible for designing this attack, and the French. So you have a very complicated situation also with the Black Sea deal, because for the Russians to be able to ship grain and fertilizer, the Europeans would have to lift some of the sanctions on Russia. Europe is not willing to do that. So Europe is digging in with all they can to prevent the war from being ended anytime soon. And then in the middle of this, we have a very peculiar incident where the defense secretary and Mike Waltz and others are on a Signal chat group talking about their bombing of Yemen, which seems rather irresponsible. But beyond irresponsible, somehow a journalist who is very hostile to Trump, who advocated for bombing Iraq over the non-existent weapons of mass destruction years ago, who endorsed Hillary Clinton, and who turns out to have been an IDF soldier and prison guard for the Israeli forces, namely Jeffrey Goldberg, is on this chat group. And he's leaking it. And who is being targeted by the leak? Who is the rage being directed against? Is it against Mike Waltz or his staffer, who supposedly are the ones who added the journalist to the thread? No, it's Tulsi Gabbard, who 2 days ago released the threat assessment report that Iran is not making a nuclear weapon. They are not a threat. It is Steve Witkoff, who seems to be the most trusted negotiator for President Trump, Kash Patel, and Ratcliffe. So the team that Trump urgently needs to carry out these negotiations is exactly what's being targeted in a way that reminds me of what happened to General Flynn at the beginning of Trump's first term. So it's an extremely dangerous situation. And now President Putin has gone, and this is quoted everywhere, frankly, somewhat out of context. Putin went to visit the sailors and crew on the Arkhangelsk nuclear submarine in Murmansk, where basically he says, we're very close, we've squeezed Ukraine, and very soon we can finish them off. And I think that he may be realizing a number of things, that if the US starts bombing Iran, we're probably not a very reliable partner for these peace talks. Even if we don't, that Europe is going to sabotage the talks, and that Russia is going to have to go it alone to get an end to this war, which they can do militarily because they're winning. He also said that only a reconstituted government in Ukraine could possibly negotiate. Zelensky's not legitimate. There were supposed to have been elections in May. That's almost now a year ago. So he is an unconstitutional, non-elected leader, not worthy to negotiate with. Putin proposed the sort of temporary UN receivership to handle one. He said that the Ukrainian people would trust to handle the negotiations and then hold elections shortly thereafter. He also had a very interesting formulation that Russia was interested in working with, and he named nations of the BRICS, Brazil, China, India, North Korea, and the United States. I didn't name other European nations. I think this is very interesting. Putin has repeatedly referenced the BRICS, thanked them for their role, and I think it's an acknowledgement, which we should hear, that the center of power in the world is shifting, and that these nations have a lot of weight politically, economically, scientifically, and we should orient in that direction. So this is where we are. The LaRouche organization will be getting out a second dossier this coming week on the British attempt to, in effect, decapitate the presidency of the United States with this onslaught, which will be getting out in Washington, D.C. And working on that is Dennis Speed, who is here with me this evening. And he will be followed shortly after that by Dennis Fritz of the Eisenhower Media Group. But Dennis, welcome to both of you. And Dennis Speed, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, well, I'll start. Thank you, Diane. And I'll start by quoting another Dennis Kucinich, former congressman from Ohio. Dennis Kucinich was for a while the manager of the RFK Jr. presidential campaign. He left that campaign at the point that RFK Jr. became expressed vociferous support for Israel in the aftermath of the October 7th attack. And Mr. Kucinich, who has been for a long time a proponent of Palestinian state, and no war in Southwest Asia for under any circumstances, had thought that he had to leave because he thought there was an overbearing control being exerted in the Kennedy campaign by forces that he could not morally agree with. But Mr. Kucinich is also a well-known figure in the Democratic Party for a long time. He's now essentially an independent. Now, on the 25th of March, he issued a warning to the Trump administration, and he pointed out, he said that it was not in America's interests before, nor is it now, to go to war with Iran, a nation of 90 million people, a technologically advanced society with nearly a million-person army. President Trump should not be misled. War with Iran would be the end of his presidency, might be the end of the presidency, period. Because as another person we spoke with earlier today, Colleen Rowley, who is a well-known whistleblower who was involved in calling attention to peculiar matters around 9/11 and the lack of follow-through on investigating well-known FBI leads at that time. She was in the Minnesota office of the FBI at the time. The way she put it is that this could actually lead to thermonuclear war, because, of course, it's important to recognize that both China and the United and Russia, in a different way, have treaty agreements with the nation of Iran, defense agreements, and those agreements would certainly be triggered by a war conducted by the United States with respect to Iran. But there's something more important that Kucinich pointed out. He talked about a time in 2002, 23 years ago, when he was in the Congress, and Benjamin Netanyahu came there and spoke. And when Netanyahu spoke, he was exhorting the United States to attack Iran, Iraq, and Libya. And when Kucinich confronted him outside, that's what he said. He said, I spoke to Mr. Netanyahu outside the hearing room and asked him that if he was so convinced these countries were a threat, why didn't Israel commence attacking? And Netanyahu said, oh, no, we need you to do that. Some of you will remember, or Wesley Clark, General Wesley Clark's discussions that 3 weeks after 9/11, when he visited the Pentagon, he was told about in a shall we say, confidential manner, that the plan of the administration was to conduct 7 wars in 5 years, and that these wars were clearly not being conducted in reaction to 9/11 per se, but that 9/11 was a sort of an opportunity, I'll put it like that, which was going to be used for that purpose. And that several of those countries have been attacked over that 25-year period, and Iran is one of the next ones. Now, while there are many that think that this can be avoided, when you see the signal incident, the signal caper, you see what kind of vulnerability exists in the Trump camp. Diane mentioned before Michael Flynn and what had happened around Michael Flynn. That's important to remember. Remember, Michael Flynn was Trump's national security advisor, and he held that position for exactly 22 days at the beginning of the Trump administration back in 2017. That was at a time when, right after, and in fact, I think it was before Trump was even inaugurated, Chuck Schumer on the Rachel Maddow show talked about how the intelligence agencies have 6 ways to Sunday to get you. And he was warning Trump of that, probably, and I think as an honorary member or a dishonorable member of the intelligence community himself. What had happened with Flynn, which is important to recognize, is that when Donald Trump came to the White House the day of the inauguration and then spoke with Barack Obama insisted in that transition meeting that one of the things that he must not do, Trump must not do, is to allow Flynn to remain in his administration. It's important to realize that Flynn, had been appointed by Obama as the director of his Defense Intelligence Agency. He served in the Obama administration from July of 2012 until I think 2014, August of 2014. What happened was that Flynn was working with the Russians to try to get a handle on Syria and with the process going on in Syria around terrorism. And in that capacity, in June of 2013, he went to, and I think he was the first U.S. intelligence officer actually ever to go to the Russian military intelligence, the GRU. He was there and he gave a lecture there. And then there was going to be a follow-up visit, but then that was not allowed. The administration stepped in and told him not to do it. He then proposed that some of the GRU officials come to the United States, and that was completely shut down by the DNI, James Clapper. Now, DNI is the same position that Tulsi Gabbard now has. And the important thing to understand is that as a director of the multiple intelligence agencies, at least the person who is responsible for briefing the president, getting Tulsi Gabbard out of that position as fast as she got in it is the commitment of elements which are treasonous elements of American intelligence, but they are also elements associated with British intelligence. Now, there's a reason we talk about British intelligence, and I want to get to that so that people don't have any confusion about it. Now, President Trump, a few days ago, once again ordered the declassification of all those papers or files related to what was called Crossfire Hurricane. That's fundamentally, it's Russiagate. Just think about it as Russiagate, because sometimes these names throw people off, and it's a confusing name because it's a code name. You're not supposed, it's supposed to hide something. That's why you get confused if you use it. Think Russiagate, and think about that entire set of lies about Trump being an agent of Russia. So what happened was this. Trump had said, and it was on March 25th, actually, that all of the files should be released. That's an order to Pam Bondi. So Pam Bondi is also obviously going to talk to Kash Patel about this. This is important to recognize that this is happening simultaneous with what we're seeing around this signal business. Because why? This would, when you take a look at this thing, the thing that's called Russiagate originates in London. Does not originate in the United States. And it originates specifically with two individuals, Robert Hannikin from the UK's GCHQ, General Communications Headquarters, and also another individual by the name of Sir Richard Dearlove, a so-called former head of British intelligence. The way this worked was that people think about Russiagate as after Trump is there, but it actually happened before that. The fall of 2015, British intelligence says it picks up all kinds of nefarious, peculiar communications involving Donald Trump. In June of 2016, in other words, the year of the election, what happens is that Robert Hannigan comes to the United States and he speaks directly to the CIA head, John Brennan. He talks to him in June, and the next month, on July 28th, Brennan starts the investigation that ultimately will be called Russiagate by people kind of in a colloquial way. On that day, he briefs Obama, Biden, Pat Lynch, former Attorney General, whatever her name is, Lynch, I'm sorry.
Loretta.
Loretta Lynch, and former FBI Director James Comey, and Clapper, also DNI, who James Clapper had been the person that stopped Flynn from going to back to Moscow, or having people come from Moscow from the GRU. So things are said that day. It's all interesting, but there are files basically that are classified from that meeting that Trump wants released. And what Trump said when he was asked about this, it was a media back and forth a few days ago. He said, well, you guys in the media are not going to like what comes out. You probably won't cover it because it's not going to say what you want it to say. We know that by July 28th of 2016, that these people were aware that Hillary Clinton had proposed as part of her electoral campaigns that they were going to try to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up the idea of a scandal, quote, claiming interference by the Russian security services. So they knew then that what was going to later be admitted about the Steele dossier. Okay. And remember that Steele is a former British intelligence agent. So the whole story around Trump comes from a former British intelligence agent besides the head of GCHQ. So this is where it comes from. And so the important element of this is that that is not, so when you're looking at Keir Starmer now, or you're looking at other things going on with the British intelligence now, or when you have Zelensky has a fight and with Trump and with JD Vance and then flies to London and is seen by King Charles, when you're seeing that, and then Starmer is going to call his coalition of the willing, which is coalition of the killing, basically, together, that didn't work. But when you're looking at this, and then you look at the way that Trump was lobbied from London, also France is in there, Paris is in there with Macron, who, of course, is his own piece of work, very peculiar piece of work. The point of the thing, as I understand, is that what we're looking at in terms of this sudden disruption in and among Trump's people, which, by the way, is a tempest in a teapot. It's not really, it is significant. It's mainly significant because of why you would be so idiotic as to use signal. Can you imagine Vladimir Putin doing that, or Xi Jinping, or anybody actually at the head of Russian intelligence? You would say automatically, they would never do that. So you know that something else is there. And as with Russiagate, it makes sense for investigators to ask the question, do we have, again, the hand of British intelligence in this stuff? We know that people like Piers Morgan and some of the people in the media are calling for people to resign in the Trump administration, or to be disciplined, or to be called out. And then we know that the Trump administration, of course, has no intention of doing that, because they have a certain kind of an offensive going vis-a-vis Russia. And that offensive cannot be allowed to be disrupted. But if you can plant doubt in Russia as to the reliability of Trump or his team to do what they say they are going to do, that may be the primary reason for doing this, as opposed to anything having to do certainly with Yemen, or anything having to do with the particulars of what was being discussed, the matters that were under consideration there. Finally, and the question of provoking war with Iran, war for the Trump administration is always going to be a negative. No matter what they're told, the Trump base and the American people, period, including people that didn't vote for Trump, of course, are going to wince at the idea of being committed to any conflict that cannot be shown to be essential to American national security. And frankly, there is no conflict in the world other than a terrorism issue, and that itself would be a very unusual. That can be said to be that kind of situation. So I think in terms of just understanding why we're saying to look in this direction, that's why. The final thing I will point out is people are looking at Israeli intelligence, and people want to look at what they call the Zionist lobby. This is not incorrect, but please, when you think Jeffrey Epstein, think Ghislaine Maxwell. Then when you think Ghislaine Maxwell, think her father, Robert Maxwell. And remember that when Robert Maxwell was buried, there were 7 different heads of, or former heads of, Israeli intelligence at his site, his graveside. But he was British. This is important because people are misidentifying things which are right there in front of them. And it's the job of Executive Intelligence Review, of course, to really delve into this story. We'll be doing that. And we certainly urge that people would read, subscribe to the publications and so on, and follow along as we go in this direction. We're not going to call it a rabbit hole. We're going to call it peeling an onion. A very rotten onion, but we're going to peel it nonetheless.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So now I'd like to hear from Dennis Fritz, who is a Command Chief Master Sergeant of the U.S. Air Force, Director of the Eisenhower Media Group, and author of the book Deadly Betrayal on the Iraq War, which I think is very important because we're looking at potentially yet again another war based on lies with much more deadly consequences if we go ahead and end up in a war with Iran, which is a different kettle of fish than the situation with Iraq. And Dennis Speed just went through some of that. So, Dennis Fritz, welcome, and please go ahead.
Diane, thanks for having me. It's always great seeing you. Before I get into the Iraq war and how it ties into everything that's going on now, I want to mention something about Signalgate because, there's something that's just mind-boggling to me in that, let me just share my background a little bit. I had a top secret clearance from 1980 until 2008. I had some of the highest clearances you could have. I was also a security manager as well. And when we talk about Signalgate, I just start wondering, was it a setup somehow? But then the setup I look at though was, did somebody, we know the national security advisor is the one that added Goldberg to the address list. But however, he said he didn't know that particular journalist. And I'm wondering, was somebody trying to stop this attack on Yemen? But at the same time, if they were probably gave it to the wrong journalist. They were probably hoping that they gave it to the journalist who would immediately leak it and stop that attack on Yemen. However, as Diane alluded to, Goldberg was an IDF, soldier at one time and a guard at one of the major prisons. So, he held on to the information. I just don't want to get into conspiracy. I don't know, but it's just all mind-boggling to me. There's some that have said, Headself should be fired. Now, I must tell you that as part of his duties, he is what you call an original classification authority. And what that means in classification talk, he can classify. He should have gone through training to know what to classify. And I will tell you that whether it was classified or not, and they said it wasn't classified, that met the criteria. That mission met the criteria for it to be classified. Because some of you that's been around the military, you heard different classifications: top secret, secret, and confidential. Confidential meaning it can cause damage. Secret meaning it can cause severe damage, and in top secret, grave damage. And we could have put some folks into grave damage, if it would have truly, been leaked. And I just wanted to share that part of it. But there's something going on there, I will tell you, because of the fact that that just doesn't happen. Now, let's talk about, Dennis Kucinich, and also about that, which the other Dennis, my namesake, probably the most handsome of the two, Dennis, the other Dennis. He talked about, the Brits and their role in probably trying to push us into war with Iran. I tell folks I can give you opinions, which I just did, and maybe, what I think. And I gave that in the scenario of Signalgate. But I want to give you a few facts as well. Bibi Netanyahu has been trying to get us in a war with Iran forever. And as I think Dennis alluded to, earlier, he talked about the 7 countries, is what Dennis was alluding to, that the then Bush administration said they were going to attack. And be quite frank, it was on behalf of Israel. And something that you said earlier, Dennis, you said, hey, Iran is next. Well, Iran is the last of that piece. All of them have been taken care of already. That was the part when Diane mentioned my book, The Truth About Why We Invaded Iraq. Well, Iraq was the first of those 7 countries that were mentioned. And then Syria. Well, if you take a look at that, Saddam is gone, and now Assad is gone. And those were the 3 main culprits in the mind of the neocons that was keeping Israel, greater Israel, from taking place. And now Iran is the one country that is still standing. And that is why Bibi has been pushing war with Iran. Now, something else that Dennis mentioned about Dennis Kucinich, well, hey, he asked the question of Bibi, why can't you do it? No, you need to do it. Well, the Bush administration, that was their intent. The Bush administration, though their goal was to help Israel and Bibi in creating the greater Israel, but they were not going to do it as Bibi is doing today, that being just outright killing and destroying the entire Gaza. They decided that the best way to do that was to get rid of the arms wing of both for Palestinians, and that was Hamas and Hezbollah. And what the Bush administration decided to do the bidding that Bibi Netanyahu wanted us to do was to take out those leaders that were supporting Hamas and Hezbollah. And if they did that, the Palestinians would no longer have an arms network to protect them from Israel, and then Israel could do as they please to displace the Palestinians. Something else that has come up, and Dennis mentioned earlier about 9/11. Well, as the Bush administration and the neocons were planning to do Bibi's bidding, they couldn't find a reason where the international community, or more importantly, the U.S. People will support a war with Iraq. And so they were trying to come up with all kinds of reasonings of going to war with Iraq. And they just really couldn't find one that could really be supported by the international community, and as stated again, more importantly, the American people. Now, we're going to tie 9/11 and October the 7th together. There are many who have said that 9/11 was an inside job. Many people, I've been beaten up about this because I won't say it's an inside job. I don't know if it's an inside job. I don't know that. However, I can tell you factually, with no doubt, that the neocons and people in the Pentagon were glad that it happened, because as Dennis alluded to, that gave them the excuse, under the disguise of the war on terror, to go in, starting with Afghanistan. That was just more so of a, okay, we got to attack Afghanistan because of the fact, allegedly, bin Laden is the one that attacked us. So we'll go there first, and then we're going to start our major plan of going in and taking out those 7 countries, starting with Iraq first. That gave us the rationale. Likewise, if we tied it to what's going on now, October the 7th, because of the fact that we could not carry out Bibi's bidding after Iraq because we got bogged down in the insurgency in Iraq, because Syria was going to be next, and then we were going to try to do Iran from the inside, but it didn't play out because we got tied up in the insurgency. Now let's go back to October the 7th. Bibi has never forgotten that we failed him in doing the bidding. So guess what, Dennis Kucinich? Bibi decided he would do it himself, starting with going in and just destroying Gaza based on October the 7th, what many have said October the 7th was allowed. Well, I tend to believe that. I don't have facts, but I tend to believe that. Why did it take so long for the IDF to respond to that? And we all know that Israel is not a large country, and it took a long time for them to respond. And so I will tell you, with Bibi, we know why Bibi. He wants that greater Israel. But when Dennis mentioned about the UK, well, we must all remember that the Zionist movement and the Palestine and the Israeli movement into Gaza and Palestine, it started in the UK with the Balfour Declaration and the Rothschilds. And so the UK still have the Zionist movement embedded in their government. Likewise, we have the Zionist lobbies here in the United States of America. And so the reason I got into this crusade was to stop that last piece of going into Iran, because as Diane alluded to about my book, I started and I wrote the book originally based on 4,000 military men and women died in that war based on a lie in support of Israel. And I didn't want to see it happen again with Iran, because I got to tell you, it'll be more catastrophic if we go to war with Iran. And I think it was that Diane had mentioned, the capabilities that Iran have. One of the things was not mentioned, which has now been proven, and we know that, is the ballistic missiles that can destroy Israel and can destroy a lot of the bases that we have in the Middle East. So I will stop there, and we can continue to have dialogue.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It is a serious situation. What I'd like to do first is ask Dennis Speed if you have any thoughts or response to what Dennis Fritz said.
Well, I would just ask that Dennis might do something for people, because, of course, we talk about these places, and you mentioned that so many places have gone to war. Could you describe what the nature is of the war fighting capabilities of the United States, and why, when you're committing to a war like this, let's take a place like Iran, which the United States dominated from 1953 to 1979. So, the United States knows every corner of Iran. So when these commitments get made, what does it entail? Just so people have a sense of what the magnitude is of this kind of decision. And then how, let's take like another question related, Iraq before and after, right? Had very high literacy, like 90% literacy, very advanced medical care, other things like that. Just that's my question for you.
Well, what I'll tell you, Dennis, is that when you look at why do we do that, it's policy driven by those that we'll say it, whether it be those in the UK or those that are here in the United States of America. When I say it's policy driven, it is those that have that goal of taking us to war. War is based on a couple things: ideology, money, and I had one more in mind that I can't think of right now. But there's money, going to war, and resources was the other. Resources. If you take a look at when you talked about Iran and how we were in control. In fact, we overthrew the democratic, the elected government of Iran. What was the reason for that? Well, they were going to nationalize their resources, their oil, and us and the UK, didn't like that. We just mentioned one other thing too. When we talk about the UK and their tie into this war with Iran and so forth, we must never forget that. And I always say it like this: we, the United States, is a child of the UK. And what do I mean by that? They were the first, over in Europe, were the first colonizers. And then we came over here and wanted our freedom and so forth, but we became the son, the child, the daughter of the United Kingdom. And so we're tied, hand in hand when we talk about going through these wars. If you think about the Iraq war, the two countries that we were keeping abreast of what we were doing was United Kingdom and Israel. And you're going to find that the three of us will always work hand in hand because of the fact of that connection. Now, when you mentioned Iraq in regards to how well the country was doing, the literacy rate and so forth, we got a better example than that. How about Libya? What we did to Libya was a functioning government, though we didn't like Gaddafi and the government, but they were a functioning government. In fact, they were going to start, probably he was leading the way and starting an African currency as well. But look what we've done to that country right now. We disintegrated that country. And so when you think about, when you say, okay, when we get ready to go to war, what are we thinking about? We're not thinking about those countries, Dennis. We can care less about those other countries. The only thing we care about is, in this case of America, American exceptionalism. In the case of the neocons, their goal is complete control of the world, to include Russia and China. And then finally, the Zionist portion of it, of the neocon movement, is all they care about is greater Israel. So when you say, okay, what is the thought in this? Those are the three reasons: complete control of the world by way of the resources and controlling it. And then the Zionists have their movement in the neocon movement of greater Israel. And then the rest of it is money.
Diane, I also have a question for you, which pertains to particularly your experience from last year when you were in the presidential zone. That is, you were running for U.S. Senate, but you were talking to candidates, and candidates were presidential candidates. When you look at the administration now and look at some of the people, some of whom we had direct interchanges with over the last couple of years, be that Tulsi Gabbard or different persons, what's your view of how those people are seen by some of the people that that campaign for them, work for them? I mean, Kucinich comes to mind for me because I've talked to him, but I just wonder what kind of feedback have you had from them, and do any of those people have a clear idea about why we're trying to build this security and development architecture?
Well, I think the one thing about the Trump administration, which is very important and perhaps related to Trump's work as a businessman, a builder, New York real estate, is he actually likes people. He likes to interact with people. He prides himself on being a very good judge of character. I'm not going to say that he is or he is not. He certainly brought some stinkers into his first administration, but and you see that. I mean, the fact that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a former Democrat, joined the team. Trump welcomed him and his base of supporters. Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democrat, a slightly different base of support. So ironically, although the media says that Trump is so divisive and hateful and racist and all of that, his campaign actually demonstrated the opposite in terms of having an ability to unite Americans from different walks of life. And people very much feel that they have access in one way or another to the administration, although they don't necessarily feel that they can influence in one way or another. I think most people who voted for Trump did so because they want peace. And he kept saying that, and Gabbard kept saying that, and Kennedy kept saying that. Kennedy also the willingness to go after the CIA and the files and so on. And I would say in the recent period, what you're seeing is a shift. People are worried. The bombing of Yemen, Trump had criticized Biden correctly in 2024 about bombing Yemen. Now Trump is doing it and saying we're going to do it for a long time. Reminds me of a t-shirt I used to see. The beatings will continue until the morale improves. It does not work. And people, it makes them nervous because they say, well, I thought I voted for this and I thought that's what they intended to do. And now it looks like something else. And I will tell you, the economy is so difficult. The cost of fuel, the cost of housing, the cost of food, the support for Trump is very fragile. And if some of these matters are not addressed quickly, people are going to turn on him. Kucinich's point, I read that within 2 years, you could have a total switch and a massive rejection of the Republican Party. I think that's very real. I'm not sure how much these people recognize that. So, and this again is something where those of us associated with LaRouche and the LaRouche organization really want to present a positive program. How do you organize an economic recovery? What are the benefits of working with the nations of the BRICS and the global South? Wouldn't that be better, as Elliot Roosevelt described his father, FDR, flying over Africa and saying, it's so short-sighted to just loot raw materials. If we would work to ensure that all these nations were out of poverty, that would be an enormous enduring market for American goods. Where are the people who think that way and who are willing to work for that?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dennis, if I can make another comment?
Sure.
Based on something you just said earlier. Now, you're going to be surprised what I'm about to say. I will tell you, George W. Bush, he came into office with no intent to go to a war. Believe it or not, Obama came into office with no intent to go to war. And if you look at my book, I talk about that, and he's even talked about that. And I will tell you with something that Diane mentioned earlier when she said, folks were voting for Trump. I think in his heart, he really I know for a fact, peace in Ukraine. And I don't think he intended to even start another war in the Middle East. But those influences in Washington, D.C. and in London, they are so powerful that they take control of the presidency when it comes to going to war. And that is what's happening right now. You hear about folks talk about the deep state, where there are folks in this world, mainly in the United States of America, Washington, D.C., and London, that are moving us. And the president just does not have any control of that. As I stated earlier, it's based on money. Okay, when you talk about money, I'm talking about the military industrial complex. Without war, there's no money for them to be made. When you talk about resources, we talk about what we have in Ukraine. Trump says the quiet part out loud when he was talking about, hey, all the minerals that we have buried, in Ukraine that we can take advantage of. The grain, Trump says it out loud, resources. And then finally, world dominance. The United States, as I stated earlier, the son, the daughter of the original colonizers. We are doing that bidding, and I tell you, it takes control of each presidential administration, no matter if they say, hey, I'm coming in for peace. It just gets overwhelming for them.
I think you hit on something which motivates for me the role of the rest of us, the citizens, particularly at this 250th birthday of the country. And I had something I wanted to show from a couple of posters. This is from a 2018 report put out by the House of Lords, literally the House of Lords. Everybody that put this thing out is from the British oligarchy, if you want to put it that way. It was a report called UK Foreign Policy and a Shifting World Order. If we have those, yeah, good. And I'll just read them off so people can, but I just want to have it up on the screen so people can hear it. Our year-long, so this is now 7 years ago. So keep that in mind and then think about how close this is to what's happening today. Our year-long inquiry confirmed the increasing volatility of international relations, a situation which poses major and novel questions and challenges for UK foreign policy. We conclude, for instance, that the UK's bedrock relationship with the United States is under disturbing pressure. The US administration has taken a number of unilateral foreign policy decisions on high-profile issues, such as the Iran nuclear deal and trade policy, which undermine the UK's interests. Now, that's a very interesting sentence. I'm going to repeat that. Just think about what this is saying. The US administration has taken a number of unilateral foreign policy decisions. Well, yeah, it's a government. So the US is, right, sovereign, isn't it? Well, they say, well, their unilateral decisions, such as the Iran nuclear deal and trade policy, which undermine the UK's interests. The UK has struggled to influence the administration, which is in part a reflection of a broader shift in the US toward a more inward-looking America First stance, with less focus on the transatlantic alliance or multilateralism. In the future, the government will need to meaning the British government, will need to place less reliance on reaching a common US-UK approach to the main issues of the day than has often been the case in the past. This comes at a time when China's economic and geopolitical influence and its technological capabilities are growing substantially. We conclude that it is not in the UK's interest to treat China systematically as an adversary. Rather, the government should aim to work closely with China and seeking to address major global challenges while ensuring such cooperation is consistent with the international humanitarian law. I just wanted to take that section. We don't need the rest of what you're seeing up on the screen. But I think what's important to realize here is that in the first Trump administration, what was made clear in this statement and some subsequent statements, which I'm not going to bother to at the moment quote, is that they see this as not just Donald Trump. They see this as a shift in the American population. And you have to think about Hillary Clinton describing much of the American population as deplorables. You have to think about the way in which the divisions have been played in the United States population, even though the people don't actually feel as divided as they are told they are. In fact, when you look at things like the elections and like this last election, there was much more unity actually, and people on the street are now talking about that as well. So I just wanted to interpolate that because I think we've got a different situation than a lot of people think we've got. I think that people have to step into this situation. The presidency is easy to isolate. There's a difference between running for office and then governing. And the forces that often influence governing are not elected. And they should not be allowed to wield the power of influence over against the power of influence of the people.
Hey, Dennis, if I can make a comment on that, what you just read,
Sure.
and just look at it from my perspective when I said that I'm going to use this term, I try to say gender neutral, but I'm just going to say son, the United States being the son of the UK. Well, what you just described there is the UK, the daddy, realizing, hey, my son is all grown up now. The son is saying, Daddy, I'm on my own now. I'm going to do this better than you. And so, and that's that separation when the UK is realizing now the United States has said, hey, we're going our separate way. We're going to do it our way now.
Yeah.
And that raises concern too. When you said, hey, the UK is going to probably start looking at China now. Go ahead, Diane. I'm sorry. Like you're ready
No,
to
that's
jump
fine.
in.
That's fine. We're getting close to time, about 10 or 15 more minutes. But I did just want to say, because since it is the 250th anniversary of our republic, you know, the founders were very clear about a certain oligarchical principle in Europe. That's why they had to leave. This caste system, dukes, duchesses, whatever your father did, you were going to do that, and your sons and daughters were going to do that, and that was your station in life, and you could not get out of it. And the principles that all men, and I will take that as universal, men are created equal, is true. In fact, Lincoln really challenged people with that in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, saying, do you believe this is only true for some people, or is it true for everybody? What's, you know, think through what that means. So as in everything, the question of form, having a conception of something which is perfect, like the idea of a circle, we can imagine a perfect circle, but if you try to construct the perfect circle, there will always be some slight margin of error, and depending on whatever tools you have available at the time, maybe it'll be a real mess, maybe you'll get close. Unfortunately, in this current sphere that we exist, we're not going to attain perfection, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for that. And George Washington, in his farewell address, there's just this very, very beautiful section about our relations with other countries. And he says, observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct. And can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period, a great nation, to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Who can doubt that in the course of time and things, the fruits of such a plan would richly repay any temporary advantages which might be lost by a steady adherence to it? So he's saying, even if it doesn't benefit you in the moment, it will benefit you in the long term to be benevolent and just. And then he says, can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent felicity of a nation with its virtue? Not only will it benefit you in the long term, but you will be happy if you are virtuous. And everyone can have the image of unhappiness when you have a bad conscience and you've done things that are horribly evil. Generally, you are not happy in that sense. So he says the experiment, at least, is recommended by every sentiment which ennobles human nature. Alas, is it rendered impossible by its vices? Question mark. This is a very tall order that George Washington is giving as he leaves office to the people who are going to be picking up the torch after he leaves.
And that's the caliber of commander of the armed forces. I mean, Hamilton, after all, was an artillery officer. You start looking at these people who fought the revolution, and everybody, of course, it's a battle, and therefore it's very dramatic. But the actual consolidation of the revolution didn't happen until you had the Constitution and then the presidency. The words you're reading are words that are written by Washington, but by Alexander Hamilton as well. He was the guy that drafted this, along with one or two other advisors. But yeah, that's the thing for us to think about. That's the standard of the United States, and that's not a matter of trying to compare Donald Trump or this one or the other one. It's a matter of comparing it to the American citizen. I mean, these are the people. This is the caliber of the people that founded the country.
On that note, I would just add, and I'm trying to remember the context, it'll make it clear, but it struck me very hard that the American people actually do have enormous power. Even though elections may be stolen, even though there's massive mainstream propaganda lying, we can change the direction of our nation. I think younger people have perhaps a more sensuous grasp of that idea, but we can. It does matter what we think and what we do. And I think, unfortunately, many Americans underestimate that, which is really a sin of omission, especially when there's so much suffering occurring in the world as a result of the bad policies of our own government.
Mm, mm.
Agree.
It's a situation right now. I mean, just with what you just said, no generation of human beings has ever had the ability to reach across the planet to one another and propose solutions of a political, cultural, or social nature. It's something to think about. And Americans, more than almost any place else in the world. I mean, there's other places that are in better shape physically. Maybe China's in better shape, but nobody in this has ever had the opportunity that this generation of Americans has. It's like what Kennedy said in his first inaugural. That this generation, the torch is passed to a new generation, born in this century, which has these capabilities. And I think that's really something for people who were born in this century to think about. People who are 25 years old or younger. Though there have been, the United States has not been at its best for sure. But the idea is the possibility. Also, you've got governments for a change. I mean, China 50 years ago was a third world nation. Russia 50 years ago was a very different place. And so I think that if, for example, let's take the upcoming conference. I think you referenced it before, Diane, and even if that wasn't elaborated, in 8 weeks we're going to be having a conference. We want everybody to come to it or be a part of the deliberations, because maybe people should think about it like this: 250 years ago, there was a Continental Congress. And that was a group of people that got together. They were just people from all over the colonies. They had no power, apparently, other than the power of assembly to deliberate as to what the direction should be for what might become a country. They didn't even know what it was going to be. Matter of fact, at that point, it was at best going to be a confederation. And then they understood that they represented something bigger. And they represented something bigger that could be very good. And I think it's the same thing. That's what people ought to do in memory of, in commemoration of that 250th birthday, if for no other reason. And maybe that, see if that happens while these problems begin to play out in Washington, then that group of Americans that thinks that way, changes their thinking to think that way, is in a position to change it. Uh, I think you're right. I think maybe that's why people don't quite understand that they can do it, because nobody seems to be doing it. But if we actually assemble people that start doing it, maybe people would just fall right in with the happy fun of changing things.
Mhm. Well, I think our enemies appreciate the power because people, even speaking the truth, who are not American citizens, are being rounded up to be deported. So clearly, there's a certain power of speaking the truth in the United States, which people wish to suppress. And I believe very strongly that a lot of this is really going to backfire. I'm just not sure we can survive
Mm.
the it's a very fine line, if someone's a chain smoker and they have a heart attack, are they going to stop smoking before the next one, or is it going to be too late? And I don't think we should gamble with that. I think it would be better to change what we're doing before we cross that line where suddenly says, oh, gee, I shouldn't have done that. So, Dennis, Fritz, do you have anything you would like to say as we wrap up here?
Well, I'll just say, Diane, it's always great talking with you, and especially my namesake, Dennis. As we still have a lot of work to do. This is probably in my most optimistic time. As I look at, I think I mentioned it to a forum, I may have mentioned it to you all, that in regards to the Middle East and Israel, a Gallup poll that was done a few weeks ago that said the decline of the support of Israel has been the lowest in 25 years. And so I think we are making a difference in regards to the Middle East. When it comes to Ukraine and Russia, for those that disagree with us trying to stop that war, I would just tell them that we're trying to save the people of Ukraine. We're trying to save their infrastructure. We're trying to stop them and stop this war that's being based on the United States of America and certain folks in Europe that are using the Ukrainian people to weaken Russia for world domination. And we must continue that fight so that we can use those monies that are being used in these wars for the social work throughout the world in helping, the people to survive, starvation, to find good housing. And so we must continue this work. And though we get frustrated sometimes, we can't stop. And so once again, I'm so happy to be with you all.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really glad you were able to make it. Dennis, Speed, any thoughts?
I just think that whenever you read the farewell address of Washington, or the people read closely the preamble of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or the Federalist Papers, that to think about the idea that that's what government is, and to think in that context of how people, like whether it's Franklin Roosevelt or Martin Luther King or others, viewed what they were doing. That's a real privilege. I mean, what other countries, Britain doesn't have a written constitution. Israel doesn't have a written constitution. You look at that, and so those people, maybe they've got a reason. I don't think a justification, but maybe a reason, because what are they alluding to? What's the culture? America has the oldest continuous democratic republic in world history. It may be a young nation, but it has the oldest continuous self-governing body in world history. And it's self-government that is the issue. But when you look at how these people thought of it and hear it, I would just advise that people might pull these documents out along with Helga Sepp-LaRouche's 10 principles for a new security and development architecture, and compare the language, compare the ideas, And I think, people, first of all, become much happier about what they have. It's often complaints about what's wrong, but what do you have? What's the basis from which you can build? What can you quote? What's been left to us to fulfill? I think that's going to be concentrating more in that area and giving people the idea that that's theirs will change a lot. And I think there's where we've got an avenue, a flank that we should make a lot more use of.
Great. Well, thank you both. If we had more people thinking in the way that you are, our nation would be in great shape. And I wish they were all in the US Senate. That would help a lot. I would just like to urge everybody who's watching to resolve to act to make our nation that noble republic that George Washington envisioned. And I would ask you further to support our work and our efforts to finally liberate ourselves fully from the vestiges of the British colonial system by donating to the LaRouche organization. And you can find the website at thelarouche.org, thelarouche.org. And thank you very much for listening tonight.